Welcome back, everybody. In this lecture, we're going to be continuing down the road that we started on in our previous lecture when we introduced ourselves to this topic called prosocial behavior. In essence, what we're going to be doing in this lecture is finding ways to connect more arguments and topics to this area that we were exploring previously. Just so we have a lay of the land, if you need a refresher on what we covered before, what we did in the last lecture is first define what prosocial behavior is, and also looked at a form of prosocial behavior in altruism. We then looked at different theories as to what evoked prosocial behavior, things like the evolutionary idea and this empathy altruism theory that was surmised by a gentleman named Batson. And then we looked at a lot of other things within social situations that could evoke an increased chance of being prosocial. We're going to continue down this path of looking at research that's examined things that increase and decrease prosocial behavior. And we're also going to look at some debates that occurred over the years that question some of our assumptions that we have going into looking at prosocial behavior in the first place. And in fact, that's where I want to start today's lecture. Most of us tend to think of prosocial behavior and altruism as this really good thing and that everybody should be altruistic, and there's acts of altruism all around us that really highlight the kind of goodness in human beings. But it is important to note, if we are looking at this from a scientific perspective, that there has been some pushback over the years on these assumptions. One of the first big pushbacks that occurred in the 1970s and 80s was this question about whether or not altruism on its own actually existed. Even though we tend to think of Batson as a researcher that very prominently pushed forward these techniques and approaches to increase people's helping behavior, some have cited Batson's work to suggest that there's very rarely any instances of people being truly altruistic. And if we consider the emotional toll that not helping can take on a person, and all of the long-term benefits of passing on our genes and other things that we might incur if we act prosocially in our environment, others reading this work has suggested that maybe altruism really doesn't ever come about. Right? Most of our acts are really just ways of eventually expecting something to come back to us. And if you throw a religious connotation onto this, the story gets even more complex if we talk about people doing things possibly to go to some heaven or Mecca that they're expecting themselves to run into at some point. This is a very interesting path that's, I guess, more for philosophers and psychologists to debate, but it is one I want you to think about when we talk about this idea of what triggers altruism. Because, again, some people have argued if you can trigger it, well, then you're really not looking at altruism. You're looking just simply at prosocial behavior, which maybe makes us want to redefine some of the theories and ideas that we've talked about thus far. Another really interesting theorist that I feel is worth mentioning, even though I'm not necessarily saying that I embrace her ideas, is a person named Ayn Rand, who came up with this very controversial idea a number of decades ago that prosocial behavior, and altruism in particular, are maybe not good things. Well, she didn't use the word maybe. She surmised that if altruism truly did exist and people were doing things in an altruistic manner, they were being really deceived by those that they were helping out. Her insistence was that a very functional world and one that's optimized is one where nobody is really trying to help other individuals with no expectation of anything in return. She suggested what's best for you is probably best for society over the long run. So giving to groups or individuals in need was actually harming them and harming society as a whole. Now, Rand didn't just argue these things. She wrote numerous books and essays trying to push this idea. And she was actually promoted in several academic areas as this figurehead of one that could kind of provide a counter-argument to a lot of the underlying assumptions that prosocial behavior were inherently good and desirable across numerous societies. Now, ironically, as she's progressed and her attempts to kind of push back religion and all of these other entities that she argued were trying to get people to act in ways that were not in accordance to themselves, she started to actually be embraced by a lot of the individuals that she had originally rejected. I'm not sure if Rand were around today, she'd be extremely comfortable with this notion of conservative values, ones deeply entrenched in religion, being the primary values that embrace her. But nonetheless, when she presented these alternative ideas, she did start a discussion about, again, the nature of altruism, and in this case, not whether or not it existed, but whether or not if it did exist, it was necessarily a good thing. But if we're looking back at what we started on earlier, it's important to note that even though many people studying prosocial behavior have been intrigued by this debate over whether or not things like altruism truly exists, or altruism, if it does exist, is inherently a good thing, most research on the topic of prosocial behavior over the years has focused on where it's coming from, what's either triggering it, or where we see differences in it, with the tendency to assume that in most instances, prosocial behavior is probably a good thing, both for the individuals being helped and society as a whole. So many researchers over the years have not only looked at the moments that we can evoke prosocial tendencies in individuals, but maybe the individuals and situations where prosocial behavior is more abundant. One of the areas that's been examined over the years is the differences between different groups of individuals that seem to not just display more or less prosocial behavior, but very specific types of prosocial behavior. Numerous studies have shown that there are very quantifiable gender differences in prosocial tendencies. Not necessarily prosocial behavior levels overall. There is some evidence to suggest that women are a little bit more prosocial than men in terms of the acts of kindness that they exhibit overall. But usually when we talk about the differences in prosocial behaviors amongst genders, it's not about the overall number of prosocial behaviors committed, but instead the types of prosocial behaviors elicited. Men tend to engage in significantly more what we call chivalrous prosocial behaviors. This usually involves things like helping somebody move or doing something physical that maybe risks health or risks pain. Women tend to engage in what's called nurturing prosocial behaviors, where they're there more for emotional help or support for other individuals. A classic example of this would be, say, helping a friend through a breakup or helping somebody deal with some of the stressors that they're encountering. Now, it's important to note that when researchers look at this and find these differences, they very rarely say that if you fall into one group, this is what you do. There's lots of exceptions to this. So I know many of you sitting there are probably thinking about these situations where you identify with one gender but don't find yourself doing X, Y, or Z. I promise you, you're going to be able to find those things. But as an aggregate, across societies, we have consistently seen that if people identify as men or women, the types of prosocial behaviors they exhibit tend to sway in one direction or another, being chivalrous or nurturing, based on the gender they identify as being a part of. This is also true for other categorizations, other groupings that people often use. One set of studies, a couple decades ago now, focused their attention on how within specific cultures, certain people might be more likely to help than others, and they might be, in particular, more likely to help specific groups versus others. In cultural research, what we've seen is in our independent society, we're not necessarily the most pro-social group of individuals. There's definitely moments where people as a whole come together and help out other individuals, but when we compare our independent society to our interdependent counterparts in East Asian, South Asian groups, what we tend to see is that their likelihood of being prosocial tends to be much higher. But there's a big caveat to this. This is not necessarily a universal thing. In interdependent societies, prosocial behaviors for what we call in-group members, it's usually family members, friends, people we're close with, is extremely high. People are just very giving in these societies, to those people that they're closest to. But when we look at their behavior towards outgroup members, people that they don't necessarily associate with, they don't know very well, what we see is that their behavior is not only more reflective of what we see in our independent society, but in many cases, it might be even less prosocial than what we see in independent societies. And this highlights some nuances to this prosocial behavior tendencies that we see. It's not that one group, again, is way more prosocial than another. It's just we calibrate when we're going to be prosocial, what we're going to do, and who we're going to be prosocial for based on some of the groups that we identify with. This is also true when we compare income groups, something that's been done just recently in the past decade or so. There was a researcher named Michael Krauss, along with another gentleman named Paul Piff and a faculty member named Dacher Keltner, who when Paul Piff and Mike Krauss were graduate students, in this study and showed that the individuals coming from high incomes, when given the opportunity to be prosocial, actually much less likely to do so than people coming from the low income groups that they used in their study. Now, there were some issues with the design of this study. Many people don't necessarily like categorizing people as high or low income. It's more of a correlational thing, but regardless, the research that Piff and Krauss did really highlighted how, when we're talking about prosocial differences, even within specific societies, there's groups that are more inclined to be prosocial than others. What we tend to see, again, is low-income individuals tend to help more, especially with in-group members. And if we're looking at the percentage of, say, money they give or time they donate to charity, it's substantially higher than individuals in these high-income groups. And this is also found in a portion of our society and other societies as well when we compare those who are extremely religious to those who are not. What we tend to see is that overall, people who identify as being very religious tend to be more prosocial as a whole. Now, there's definitely differences amongst the different religious affiliations, but as an aggregate, again, there's always individual differences. I need to keep stressing this, but as an aggregate, what we tend to see is those that affiliate themselves with a specific religion and affiliate themselves with it strongly tend to describe more instances of them being prosocial than those who are not. Now, what's really interesting about this, though, is that Batson and others, Batson being the same researcher we've talked about before, have suggested that many of the underlying differences when we look at religion might be based on the types of prosocial behaviors we commit. Batson suggested that those committing prosocial behaviors under the name of religion tend to do it more often in a public way. Right? They tend to give to charities where it's known that they're doing it. They tend to do things that others can see and kind of tie to their religious connotations. Now, it is also important to note when we make that statement that there have been some that have pushed back on Batsman's research and suggested that even if we control for the public versus private actions, we see higher rates of prosocial behavior from those who are religious. But, it again adds a wrinkle to things. It highlights, when we look at all of these, how when we find ourselves drawn to specific groups, when we give ourselves a specific identity, that identity that we form does shape not only our proclivity to be prosocial, but the types of prosocial behaviors that we're more inclined to exhibit. Now, in addition to examining ways that prosocial behavior can be increased within specific groups, a lot of attention has also been focused on groups that are significantly less prosocial. One of the topics that's been looked at extensively over the years is this notion that people from inner cities and in large populations tend to be significantly less prosocial towards their neighbors than individuals in what we nowadays call rural areas. And this is actually linked to a term or a concept called the urban overload hypothesis. It's this notion that the more and more populated the city we find ourselves in becomes, the less and less likely we are to help in each situation where prosocial behavior could potentially aid in somebody else that is in need. This is something that's often highlighted in the number of people we say give charity to, or the number of individuals who have needs that we come to the aid of. And it is important to note that there is significant evidence to show that percentage-wise, people from urban areas, when they're prompted to help another individual, do help significantly less in terms of the percent that they help when asked than those in rural areas. But why this is the case is a little more cloudy. Some theorists have argued that maybe it relates to the fact that we are in urban areas inundated by requests for help, where in rural areas the requests are so few and far between that when they happen, we feel significantly more inclined to do so. There's even some research that's shown that as people get more and more kind of indoctrinated into an urban area or just accustomed to some of their surroundings, they become more and more callous or less and less willing to help individuals in those environments. It's also important to note here that there's numerous studies that have shown it doesn't really matter where you're born as much as it matters where you're currently living when we talk about how this urban overload hypothesis works. But it's also probably important to note before we close this out that even though we do see pretty dramatic differences in the locations of individuals and their percentage chance of helping, there have been some follow-up studies to show that people located in urban areas do actually have a slightly higher proclivity towards helping others than those in rural areas if we look at the aggregate number of prosocial behaviors we commit. In essence, we're constantly in urban areas bombarded by requests for help, and we do help occasionally. It's just, percentage-wise, not that often. Where in rural areas, we're much more inclined to help when asked. It's just so infrequent that, it doesn't occur as much. Another idea that's been floated to explain this also relates to the difference between what we call in-groups and out-groups, something we've alluded to earlier. There's some individuals that believe that individuals from rural areas simply see a lot of their neighbors, the people that they have the potential to help out, as part of their in-groups, and in fact might know a large portion of the people that they encounter on a day-to-day basis, where those in urban areas very rarely come across individuals that they're familiar with when they're in a large population. Now, there is more on this in the readings that talk about statistics pertaining to when we reach a specific threshold, but I did want to introduce it as, again, an indicator that sometimes when we look at prosocial behavior, we don't just look at what could cause an uptick, but what could definitely cause a downtick. And this relates to another topic that we've discussed over the years called residential mobility. The fact that people who find themselves in an area and are expecting to be there only for a short period of time are much less prosocial towards members of their community than those that find themselves in a place that they're planning to invest in or be at for a long period of time. Again, just like the urban overload hypothesis, we not only have found evidence for this effect, but there's been lots of theories as to why it occurs. Some talk about how maybe in this case, when you are invested, you're trying to sort of trigger that social exchange theory that we so intuitively know about. Others have argued that maybe what's going on when people are moving is they're not necessarily wanting to invest a bunch of their resources and time in an area that isn't going to necessarily be the place they want to have lifted up versus another place that they're going to be in. It's tough to really explain clearly why this particular effect is happening, just as it's tough to really explain why the urban overload hypothesis is occurring. But sometimes it's not necessarily about an explanation that we need when looking at this, as much as it is just some type of predictor, some value that can tell us when we're inclined to help and when we're not. And this also relates to another really interesting effect that shows situations that can get people to be significantly less prosocial. It's actually something that was introduced by economists a number of decades ago, something called the prisoner's dilemma, something that works so unbelievably well that it was actually used by many police training programs and other programs trying to help increase conviction rates until it was realized that This technique is so unbelievably powerful that it actually gets people to not only be less pro-social, but do things that are very harmful and sometimes dishonest simply because of the situation that they're presented. In this prisoner's dilemma, what hypothetically happens is you have two individuals that have potentially committed a crime that are going in and being interviewed by police officers. They're separated into their own rooms and they're given the same bit of information. They're told that they do not get to communicate with the other person that they were brought in with, and that both individuals are going to be offered a deal. They're going to be told if they confess, then one of two things will happen. If they confess and their partner confesses, both individuals, based on the evidence they have, will probably be locked up in jail for 5 years. But if they confess and their partner does not, if their partner remains silent, then their partner will have to go into jail for 20 years, but they'll get to walk home free. Of course, if they remain silent and their partner confesses, then the opposite will happen. And if both people remain silent, there's enough evidence, they believe, to still convict people, just maybe not to the same level. When people are presented this information, when they're asked what they'd like to do, what numerous studies have shown in this prisoner's dilemma is that our de facto response is almost always to confess. In fact, it's so powerful that many times people confess to something that they hadn't actually done. And we're going to look at this again when we get to the social psych and the law lecture that's coming up in a few weeks. But just understand that at the heart of this particular study is a way to trigger people to be significantly less pro-social. Because obviously, if our de facto response is to confess, we know we're putting the person we're paired up with in a lot more harm than they would be if we ourselves did not confess. In fact, way less harm would be coming to our partner if we just remain silent in this specific situation. But what triggers it? What causes us to, in this situation, feel the implicit need to confess? Well, just so we have some context before we move on to some things we can do to tweak this to lower the rates of confession, I want you to notice that in both situations, your partner confessing or not, the best option for you is to always confess. If your partner confesses, it's much better to be in jail for just 5 years versus 20 years. If your partner remains silent, well, it's better to just walk free than to be in jail for a year. And that focus, that fixation on the self, is what many believe leads people to do what they do in the prisoner's dilemma. But are there ways we can tweak it? So what can we do to actually decrease the likelihood of people confessing, or in this case, get them to be more pro-social in this hypothetical scenario? What research has shown is that if people are exposed to this a couple times, they have a tendency to actually be more inclined to not confess. Our first go around almost always leads us down that path, but when we think about it from a more analytical perspective, the recognition of not confessing and its value starts to become more apparent. It's also true when we talk about ways to make people more pro-social in the future. First time somebody encounters something where they have a chance to act in a pro-social way, we'd have a tendency to be more hesitant, not be as inclined to help. But if we're given another opportunity to do so, if we're given a chance to act pro-socially, well, that increases, or at least the chances of doing it, increase dramatically with each exposure. Another thing that can really impact our ability to be helpful, or our tendency to be helpful, is how a situation is labeled. In that prisoner's dilemma example that we talked about, the phrasing, prisoner's dilemma, and many believe might be one of the things that lead people right off the bat to confess. If that game is rephrased as the cooperation game, we tend to see people engage in behaviors that are significantly more pro-social. If it's phrased the Wall Street game, like it was in a study done back in 2002, people actually become significantly less pro-social. much more greedy, and not just in this prisoner's dilemma, but in a whole variety of different situations where they have the option of being prosocial or kind of selfish in a situation. Another thing that can really help is by evoking those empathic feelings that we talked about earlier. In fact, earlier we talked about a study done by a pair of researchers named Paul Piff and Michael Krauss. Well, they, along with their fellow colleagues, not only showed that there was differences in income levels and people's willingness to be prosocial, but they showed that these tendencies could be all but obliterated if people were enticed to try to become more empathetic. In essence, those in the higher income level immediately became significantly more prosocial when they were forced to think about the needs and feelings of others. Another shocking example of how, when we're talking about prosocial tendencies, there's a lot of things that go into our likelihood of helping. And if we look at another study that we've talked about before, we can see another kind of hint that cueing things, phrasing things differently, can get people to be more prosocial. If you remember back several weeks ago, we talked about a study done by a pair of researchers named Sharif and Noren Zion. In this study, people were asked to come up with sentences for words that were either neutral or spiritual in nature. And what they found was that people who had spiritual words embedded within their activities tended to be significantly more giving and prosocial when asked to distribute funds for participation in the study. All of this highlights how not only can we see trends that lead people to act prosocially or not, but we can also tweak those trends just by changing the scenario up a tiny little bit. So, what is a take-home message that we can get from all of this information? Well, my hope is that after we've covered this, you have a better sense of what things can relate to increased levels of prosocial behavior and the value of it. I understand that obviously in this lecture we debated whether or not altruism was necessarily a good thing and whether or not altruism really existed, but I'm hoping that there's some consensus among most of us that being nice in general is a pretty good thing. And hopefully now that we've covered a lot of these topics over the last two lectures, you now know certain things in your life that might make you more inclined to be prosocial and others that might make you less. And by arming yourself with that information, well, it might help you be a better contributor to society than maybe you were before going through this. You can also use this information to better understand why certain people are more prosocial than others and what might entice others to be prosocial in specific situations. I'd also encourage you to really tap into some of those things that we discussed earlier, like good moods and empathic thinking, to help yourself along the way when you find yourself in struggles. And just remember that if you do engage in this, not only will that help you and those that you're helping, but there's numerous studies that have shown, as we've discussed before, that once we start doing something, it tends to create a snowball effect that gets not just us to do something kind, but the person seeing us to do the same, and the person seeing them to do the same. Maybe we're not necessarily talking about a movie-worthy example like some of you might be thinking about right now, but the mimicking effect is legitimate. There's a lot of evidence to show that once one person helps, another is much more inclined to do so afterward. And that's hopefully the take-home message that you can get from what we've covered so far. This does mean, since we're getting to that take-home point, that we're going to be wrapping up with the topic of prosocial behavior. We're not quite done with the general topic yet, because in our next class, we're going to be examining sort of the opposite of altruism or prosocial behavior when we start talking about aggression or sometimes what's called antisocial behavior. Much like we did here, we're going to look at all the sources to these things and some of the things that have proven to be pretty big factors in who's more inclined to be aggressive and who's not. Hope you'll be ready for that journey when we get to it, but for now, take care, good luck, and I hope to see you soon.